So what was happening south of there? So the Hurons were up in here on the north side of Lake Ontario. They're trying to push down in here and succeeding somewhat, but the Iroquois Confederacy weren't going to just take that laying down, and so they made alliance. The Iroquois Confederacy here, what were called the Five Nations. They made inroads with Dutch explorers from the Netherlands who initially landed down here by what's now New York City. There were some initial altercations, but the first major Dutch expedition up the Hudson River was led by a man named Henry Hudson, for which the river is named. And he established some trading posts and started making pretty good relationships with the various natives in the region. And they would give their own weapons to those people to try to push back against the Huron incursions and establish themselves in those trade routes. So there were interesting outcomes to what the Dutch caused because they inspired a series of wars called the Mohawk Wars, which were between the Mohawks, part of the Five Nations, and the Mohican, who lived here in western New England, southern New York, and the Mohawk ended up winning that. And the result was more incorporation of European economy. It was actually a war that the Mohawks were fighting against the Mohicans to establish more European influence, not less. Like the Hurons, after contact occurred more and more among the Iroquois, their population started to decline. That caused them to go on a series of raids against their neighboring peoples in all directions. And they were called mourning wars. Mourning as if you're mourning someone who died. Those were conflicts that some natives would engage in to try to replenish their populations when they suffered some kind of setback. And so they'd go to war with the purpose of gaining captives. And a series of devastating raids took place against the Huron. The Dutch supported their allies with weapons and goods. They were somewhat better traders than the French at that time, and started giving a lot of guns to their allies. And it actually caused complaints in the Netherlands because the budget for giving guns to the natives that were engaging in the mourning wars started to be a budget problem for them. But in any case, the Dutch did not discriminate like the French did, where the French could have given more guns to their allies, the Hurons, but they didn't because they started only giving them to the ones who converted to Christianity, whereas the Dutch didn't discriminate. They just traded guns to any of their trading partners if they did what they wanted. And so that established better relations, some favorable peace treaties. As a result, the Huron were at a significant disadvantage in the Mourning Wars and against Iroquois raids, and some of the remaining Huron began to desperately convert to Christianity so that the French would give them more guns. Over the next 10 years, this series of conflicts, so these conflicts that occurred over about 10 to 20 year period from the 1640s to 1660s, were called the Beaver Wars. The results were that the Huron were basically destroyed as a confederacy. Their people dispersed around the entire region. So what had been a powerful grouping, who were powerful in the first part of the 17th century, by the second half of the 17th century, basically ceased to exist as a power and dispersed themselves. And were a shell of what they once were. Some joined the Iroquois. Some of the Christians went to live under the protection of missionaries. Others dispersed into what's now Michigan. The French tried to reorient their trade relationships with other communities, such as the Ottawa and the Potawatomi. So Ottawa here, Potawatomi here, and Ojibwe there. But those too were attacked by Iroquois raiders. It took the French until the late 1650s, early 1660s to figure out that the Iroquois were on a mission to monopolize the whole fur trade and do on a bigger scale what the Huron had done earlier in the century. And they started to finally relax the restrictions on giving guns to their allies only if they're Christians, which enabled more of their allies to resist Iroquois attacks. But what this all illustrates here is that relatively small European presence, there were maybe a few thousand. I think there were never more than 9,000 Dutch settlers, and almost all of them in New Amsterdam, what became New York City. And there were maybe a similar number, probably around 5 to 15,000 French total in all of their colonies, which mostly were lined up here in several cities along the St. Lawrence River. So a relatively small footprint, but huge impacts to the way native societies worked and how they engaged with each other.